So thank you very much for joining us on this third session of the Urban Models Seminar. I am Clémentine, and together with my colleagues Ali and Ruta, who are waving at the moment, from TU Delft, we're very happy to see you again to discuss classical analytical urban models and their circulation. So every month, an expert of urban studies and modeling dissect one model with a general question in mind, and this question is, what are the unforeseen consequences of urban model simplifications on our understanding of cities? Indeed, urban models are simplifications of reality, but those simplifications are not neutral. They are modeling choices. They can be implicit or explicit, but they have consequences in any case on how we view, represent, and act in cities. So tracing the discrepancy between model results and empirical analysis back to the urban model's core assumptions and design is crucial to provide guidance on how to use models appropriately, to avoid misleading conclusions, and ultimately to create better models. So last month, we heard Justin Deloy present the unforeseen consequences of Alonso's model. The recording is now available on our YouTube channels, Urban Models Seminar Series, where you can subscribe. It won't be in French for you. And you can replay session 1 by Denis Plumin and session 2 by Justin Deloy. This month, I'm very happy to introduce the newly Dr. Jessie Lerousseau to talk about economic-based theory. Jessie recently obtained his PhD in economics at the Faculty of Economic, Social, and Territorial Sciences at the University of Lille in France. Member of the Canadian Economists Association and the French Association of Political Economy, his work focuses on the analysis of territorial development. He has a macroeconomic background, but is also inspired by social geography, institutional approaches and of development, economic-based theory, and regional multiplier theory. He also works for public research and statistical organizations to evaluate the territorial impact of public spending, which leads him to conduct meta-analysis on methods and economic models of regional economy. Today, he will present the assumptions behind economic-based theory and their impact on local development recommendations in urban studies and planning. From its original approach, focusing on inner relationships between local economic sectors, to its later consideration of connections between territories at the regional scale, he will explain how this model has led to very distinct urban policies over its trajectory, over its circulation history, and he will also present its relation to alternative models that try to compete with this model. I'm very pleased to hear Jessie present his work today, and I will hand over to him for a presentation of about 30 to 40 minutes. Then we will open the floor to questions. As usual, you can type your questions at any moment in the chat. Ruta, as usual, will be moderating the chat. So if you want to ask a question, type it in the chat. If you want to intervene yourself, especially if it's a very specific question that requires context, then just mention in the chat that you want to ask it yourself, and Ruta will call you at that moment. And without further ado, I think that's all for me. So now it's over to you, Jessie, if you don't mind sharing your screen. And you've got 30, 40 minutes. And thank you again for accepting this invitation. And you are still on mute.
It's okay?
Yes, super.
Thank you. Hello. Firstly, I would like to thank Clémentine, Ruta, and Ali for having organized this seminar. I'm a macroeconomist. I study the impact of income flows on local development. It drove me to look at the economic-based theory. I will present you this theory in 4 points. Firstly, I will introduce the main hypothesis of the economic-based theory. Secondly, I will discuss the circulation of this theory in regional science. Thirdly, I will present some applications of it in urban research and its implications on policies. Finally, I will present you the input-output model and proceed with economic-based theory, focusing on the complementarities that emerge between the two models. I would like to start by introducing the economic base theory and its main hypothesis. The economic base theory is a regional and urban model that has been developed by geographers and economists. It aims at explaining how cities and regions develop by studying regional circulation of all types of income, from earned income to social income. There is no consensus on the origin of this theory. For instance, Douglas North and Richard Andrews identified Homer Hoyt, who was economist, as the founding father of the economic base theory. On the other hand, Krum and Davies identified Werner Sombart, who was an economist and sociologist, as the first to develop the concept of the economic base to analyze city development. I will not dwell on this point because it is not essential to my subject. I will rather address the hypothesis of this theory. The particularity of the economic base theory is its dual conception of the income flow. Two main concepts define it. On the one hand, there is the economic base. It includes the local production that absorbs the demand of non-residents. For example, the economic base includes the output of large industries that sell their products to international markets. On the other hand, there is the residential economy, or home economy. It defines the local production that absorbs the demand of residents. It includes, for example, personal services or retail trade. There are two main approaches of the economic base theory, which differ by their definition of the economic base and their conception of the relation between the economic base and the residential economy. I will come back to these two models in more details in the next part, but I will give the gist of it. The standard economic base model defines the economic base as an export base and focuses on the inner relation between the economic base and the residential economy. The said relations are inner relations because they are contained within the studied region. The standard economic base model defines inner relation around the idea that, firstly, the residential economy depends on the economic base, and secondly, that the residential economy does not influence back the economic base. The complementary hypothesis is to suppose that the economic base of a region is independent from the economic basis of all other. However, some researchers criticized this model, explaining that the standard model is not realistic to understand the development of all regions. In particular, there were two main researchers addressed the pitfalls of the standard model, and I will focus on what we can call the extended model. The objective of extended model is to expand the geographical application of the economic base theory by rejecting its two main hypotheses. Firstly, geographers and economists suggested to take into account the effects between economic bases by defining more broadly the concept of an economic base. As I said before, I will come back with more details later on the presentation. Secondly, other researchers suggested to take into account the impact of the residential economy on the economic base by redefining the concept of a residential economy to include its externalities on the economic base. Now, I will use these two main declinations of the economic base theory to present its circulation in regional science. Urban researchers have introduced the main hypothesis of the standard model at the beginning of the 20th century. I remind you that the standard model defines the economic base as an export base, which implies that export drives the residential economy. We can easily see that distinction in the different naming used throughout the literature. For example, Werner Sombart distinguished the urban population that earned its income from the outside, the city farmers, and the urban population whose income depends on consumption of the city farmers, the city fillers. Rousseau opposed the primary employment of the economic base and secondary employment of the residential economy. Haig opposed primary jobs, which manufacture export goods, and auxiliary jobs dedicated to the consumption of the primary employees. Nussbaum made the same distinction than Werner Sombart by opposing town builders and town fillers. Andrews distinguishes basic jobs and complementary jobs, also called service jobs. According to Vining and Hoyt, the economic base includes all export employment, and the residential employment or passive employment defines local employment that depend on export employment. Hildebrand and Maas and North provided the macroeconomic explanation of the supposed dependence of residential jobs on export base. For them, exports increase the local demand and production capacities because export-based workers spend their income in the residential economy. Then, other researchers attempted to improve the prediction of the standard model in order to anticipate the development of cities and regions. For example, Ullman and Dassey, who was geographers, developed a method to measure more precisely the impact of the export base on the residential economy. Krikelas showed that econometric modeling was used in 1970s to predict the impact of the export base on the residential economy. Despite the use of innovative methods to improve predictions, the standard model was not found to be reliable. Gouguet explained that the export model permits only to understand the development of small areas which depend on large export infrastructures. For him, the hypothesis of the inner relation between exports and the residential economy is not realistic for larger cities. Moreover, Gouguet observed that there are developing areas which are not exporting. And so he suggests restricting the use of the standard model for small areas only. The extended model was precisely developed to expand the geographical applications of the economic base theory to larger areas like big towns. I suggest presenting now the circulation of the extended model. The extended model of the economic base theory relies on the observations that exports do not determine the development of all cities. As I said above, the extended model explains these observations in two ways. Firstly, we extend the definition of the economic base by including other expenditures than exports. It follows that a part of the residential economy is not dependent on the export base alone. Secondly, we introduce the impact of the residential economy on the economic base through its externalities. With regard to the first explanation, namely the economic base definition, some researchers have been trying to redefine economic base more broadly. For Isa, exports do not necessarily lead to local development, because other cities or regions capture incomes of export base. For example, it is the case when an exporting city imports intermediate goods to produce their export goods. In this context, Hazard suggested to study the connections between economic base of one city and the imports of another city. Hazard's proposition means that it is necessary to change geographical scale to understand how cities develop. In the same way, to understand why developing cities are not exporting, Charles Thibault explained that some developing cities capture income of exporting cities by tax revenues and residential attractiveness. Therefore, Thibault suggested to include in the economic base social incomes, national public expenditure, and private transfers, adding a transfer base to the export base. We can find a similar approach in Fourness, who also suggests including in the economic base the income that is not related to the local production, namely social income and public expenditures. More recently, in the same way, in France, Laurent Davies identified 4 economic bases. The productive base, which refers to exports, the medico-social base, which refers to social benefits, the public base, which refers to public employment, the residential base, which refers to commuters, pensioners, and tourists. Davies studies the connections between productive base and transfer bases of regions to understand how territories develop. The originality of Davies' approach is to distinguish 2 main development models. The first one is a productive model, or big city model, which rely on export base. The second one is a residential model, or peripheral model, which rely on transfer bases, and more precisely on the private transfer base. I will come back to this point in the next report. Now, I will present you how researchers introduce in the model the impact of the residential economy on the economic base. Blumenfeld analyzed this effect by focusing on the relation between export companies and their local suppliers. For him, local suppliers, who belong to the residential economy, play a driving role in the competitiveness of export companies. Blumenfeld introduced the idea that the export base depends on the quality of interactions between residential suppliers and export companies. In the same way, Thibault showed the positive impact of residential infrastructures on the competitiveness of the export base. For example, he showed the necessity of expenditures in transport infrastructures because it attracts more export companies. Lane included residential investments in the economic base, among which there are real estate investments, which impact positively on the construction sector. According to Persky, Ranier, and Juver, if cities and regions reduce their import by developing the residential economy, they increase the effects of the economic base on urban development. Kendall and Pegosi and Rutland and O'Hagan identified domestic sectors as playing a decisive role in the economic base, following Charles Thibault. All these researchers showed that many cities develop by investing in residential economy and not only in the economic base. Residential investments are necessary to develop the attractiveness of cities through their externalities on export companies and the employed population. To summarize the second part, there are two conceptions of economic-based theory. The standard model focuses on the inner connection between the economic base and the residential economy, assuming that residential economy is passive. This model is pertinent to understand how small areas develop due to the implementation of large infrastructures, such as a large industry. The extended model introduces a reflection on the connection between cities, more particularly between economic bases of cities. Moreover, this economic-based approach shows the positive effects of the residential economy on the export and the private transfer basis. I will now discuss the impact of the economic-based theory on urban research and policies by giving some examples of the use of these two models. With regard to the circulation of the standard model in urban research, Hoyt's approach was on one of its first applications. Following a request from the Federal Housing Administration during the Roosevelt administration, Hoyt elaborated a predictive methodology by using employment data. Indeed, in the United States during the early 1930s, there was a strong rural exodus, and the Federal Housing Administration expected a rise in demand for housing in the cities. To predict the migration of people from countryside to city, the Federal Housing Administration requested Hoyt to carry out a prospective study. In this context, Hoyt proposed to predict the local effect of migration of people by estimating the impact of the export base on housing growth. According to Hoyt, by exporting, cities develop many urban services and therefore attract people. It was his main predictor of migration. More particularly, Hoyt's methodology consists in calculating a multiplier ratio by dividing basic employment to total employment. This ratio means how many employment will be created by an additionally basic employment in a city. This methodology of Hoyt was then used by many researchers to evaluate impact of the export base in other contexts. For example, following a request from local authorities, North used Hoyt's methodology to show how regions of the northwest of the United States developed themselves by exporting their timber. Other researchers used Hoyt's methodology to assess the local impact of big infrastructures, such as the implantation of a military base. For example, to evaluate local effects of a military base in Arizona, Billings calculated the Hoyt multiplier ratio. He mainly claims that an additional military employment generates an additional residential employment through resident expenditures. Richardson pointed out that Hoyt's methodology was still used in the 1980s in urban research. With regard to policy recommendations, the standard economic-based model leads to export-oriented development policies. For example, large infrastructures or export subsidies. The objective of this recommendation is to improve competitiveness of companies by reducing their costs. Concerning the extended model, Marcuson and Schrock assessed the impact of culture on rural areas in the United States by analyzing the circulation of tourist income. They showed the positive impact of tourist consumption, which sustains rural communities. In the same way, in France, the National Statistics Office created an employment nomenclature founded on this argument. This nomenclature defines what I can translate in English as a specially local demand employment. This specially local demand employment is generated by residents living and working in the region, by residents which income originates from outside the region, and by tourists. It is a good example of how the extended base model is more comprehensive than the standard model. Indeed, in the standard model, there are neither tourists, nor commuters, nor pensioners, that is to say, no local demand in the region with outside income. This nomenclature was created following a request from mayors in France who needed to predict the impact of tourism activity. More precisely, it captures the seasonal variation of local employment in order to adapt local policies to this context. Instead of export subsidies, Kay suggested that local authorities should implement import substitution policies in order to amplify the positive effect of the economic base on the residential economy. Import substitution policies require a public investment in the residential economy, but provide return multiplier effect of the economic base. In France, Davies assessed the effects of reduced state spending on local development by showing the decline of rural areas depending on state expenditures. He claimed that the development of many rural areas in France rely on the transport base because these communities were struck by high unemployment and could not attract active population of tourists. In the same way, by using the extended model of economic base, Davies showed that metropolises do not develop much, even though it contains the most part of activity. He explained that a lot of employees who work in the metropolises do not live in the metropolises, but in the peripheral areas. Therefore, these commuters consume their income from metropolitan activity in the peripheral communities, and hence they contribute to develop the residential economy at their place of residence. Davies concluded that there are two main urban models in France. The metropolitan model, which concentrates employment but not income, and the peripheral model, which concentrates income but not economic activity. In France, Davies has had a strong echo in the local policies community due to conducting many studies ordered by French metropolises and regions. In particular, he has advocated public policies in favor of metropolises, insisting that Paris contributes to the development of other regions by tourism and commuting. To summarize this part, we can retain two main elements. Firstly, the standard model is relevant to assess the local effect of large infrastructures on small areas, and the extended model is relevant to explain more global economic development of larger areas and connections between them. Secondly, it seems that the extended model, based on the analysis of the circulation of income, is useful to understand local development in an interdependencies context. In addition, by distinguishing economic activity at the place of work and economic activity at the place of residence, the extended model explains local economic development in a context where metropolises keep gaining importance. I would now like to present a complementary approach to the economic base theory, which has also been widely used in regional economics, the input-output approach. I suggest insisting on the common points and the divergences of this approach. As I said it in the beginning of this presentation, there is a second way to address the pitfall of the standard model. It emerged from some external criticisms and has driven some researchers to prefer adopting the input-output model. Richardson, for example, suggested abandoning the economic-based model because it does not correctly measure all local effects of external expenditures. According to Richardson, economic-based model present two limitations in evaluating local effects of external expenditures of a region or a city. Firstly, the economic-based model is a short-term approach. It does not study the effects of technology on regional and urban development. Secondly, it does not sufficiently consider the effects of imports on local development. Richardson explained, for example, that the Hoyt multiplier ratio is too simplistic because this ratio relies on the hypothesis that when an export good is identified, there is no imports of this good, and conversely. Richardson didn't have in mind the extended model of economic-based theory, and so he reduced the economic-based theory to the standard model. His criticism of economic-based theory was mainly focused on the application of the standard model in urban research. On the other hand, Romanoff criticized more globally the economic-based approach by insisting on its hypothesis. According to Romanoff, the dual conception of economic-based theory introduces a bias because it amounts to suppose that there is no relation between basic sectors. For example, if a city exports computers, companies producing computers will need electronic components. Therefore, before exporting computers, these companies increase their demand to industries of electronic components. Then, to produce electronic components industry will need to use metals. Therefore, they increase their demand to the metallurgical industry, and so on. In my example, companies which produce computers, industries which produce electronic components, and metallurgical industries are all included in the economic base. But due to its dual conception, the economic-based model does not study the local effect of exports between different sectors within the economic base. More particularly, Romanoff explained that the economic-based model does not allow to measure all local effects of export because it does not consider the effects on intermediate demand of the export base. The input-output model allows considering the intermediate demand at the cost of abandoning the dual conception of economic-based theory, because the intermediate demand can refer to the economic base as well as the residential economy. Input-output conception of economic circuit relies on the distinction between the final demand and the intermediate demand, whereas the economic base theory relies on the distinction between the economic base and the residential economy. From this conception of economic circuit, the input-output approach aims at understanding how cities and regions develop by studying effects of the final demand on the local production through intermediate goods. Final demand includes consumption, investment, public expenditures, and exports. And intermediate demand includes all the companies-to-companies demand that is necessary to produce final goods and services. In this model, the economic base can unpack directly local production. because some sectors of the economic base can also be part of intermediate demand. Leontiev is the founding father of the input-output approach, but Walter Isar has applied this approach to regional science. For example, Walter Isar elaborated a multi-regional input-output modeling to evaluate local impact of marginal evolution of final demand. Moreover, Walter Isar drove a study in 1960s to evaluate the effect of the Vietnam War on the Philadelphia economy by using the input-output approach. Despite the ambitious objective of the input-output model that consists in evaluating local effects of demand variations, this approach requires a lot of data to be applied. More precisely, the input-output model needs a comprehensive accounting to be applied in urban and rural research. In France, there is a national accounting, but there isn't a local or regional accounting. And so it is very difficult to use the input-output approach in regional research. This limitation on data is translated in limitation on which model regional science can use. That's why the standard model remained relevant and widely used for a long time. To sum up, I think it is important to keep in mind that the economic base theory evolved by internalizing some criticisms. At the origins of the economic base theory, the standard model was developed to predict the impact of external demand on the urban development. It was designed to produce local impact studies and to meet the request of authorities for economic and demographic predictions. The model and the method were simplistic. Only exports were supposed to impact directly urban growth, and other expenditures were supposed to be generated by exports. But these hypotheses are only realistic for small areas, but depend on an export companies such as industrial small areas. Indeed, the global economy cannot export, yet it is overall developing. Conversely, it is hard to imagine how a small area would manage to develop without exporting. To understand the development of large cities or more global regions, it is necessary to relax the main hypothesis of the standard model. That's why researchers suggested expanding the economic base model by studying the effect of the residential economy to the economic base and the effects between economic bases of some regions. Now, the extended model allows understanding why developing communities are not exporting and why exports are not enough to develop cities. I can recall some of this explanation. Firstly, it is necessary to develop residential economy in order to reduce imports or to generate externalities, and so to amplify multiplier effect of economic base. Secondly, some urban or rural communities capture income from activities of metropolises, and so they develop without exporting. Today, the extended model of the economic base theory offers interesting perspectives to urban research and policies. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for presenting this model and for keeping the time to perfection. So thank you very much. I don't think there are any questions yet on the chat, but I invite everyone to write their question on the chat if they have some. And in the meantime, that leaves me the chance to ask the question I ask at every session and also a second one. So I'm putting them on the chat for everyone to read them if they want to. But my first question would be, what is, according to you, the main misunderstanding of economic-based theory? And how did it influence research and policy? So at every speaker, I asked this question because that's really what I'm looking for in those different seminars. And my second question was initiated because I think compared to the two sessions we had about Christaller and about Alonso's model, the case you presented is quite original. So we don't have one single author for this economic-based theory. You showed that it's got an obscure origin, and then it was complemented by people. So they added things to the model along the way. So would you say that it's the reason for its success because it's adaptable and you can always add something to make the model better? But is it also creating more potential misunderstanding and confusion about the modeling choices because no one knows which version of the model you are referring to? So 2 questions, well, 4 actually. So you can pick and choose which ones you prefer to answer. And you will have to unmute yourself, please.
Thank you, Clémentine, for your question. With regard to the first question, I think the main problem was with the standard economic-based model, because this model like to not consider revenue impact on local development. It was only focused on export, and it was the main critique to this model. And to adapt this in response to political communities, extended model was developed to correct the lack of standard model. And so today, I think economic-based model is comprehensive, and whereas standard model is not comprehensive. Concerning the origins of economic-based theory, today there are a lot of researchers that claims that there is different origins of economic-based theory, and so I agree with you. Each explained with its mind the function of economic-based model. It's okay. I have finished to reply.
Rita, do you want to?
Yeah, thank you, Jessie. I was just looking at Clementine's reaction. Yes, we have a question from the audience. Do some researchers link economic-based theory with the notion of external economies of scale? For example, Marshall, 1920s.
Sorry, can you repeat, please? I haven't.
Yeah, you can also see it in the chat if it's more convenient. But some researchers who would link economic-based theory with the notion of external economies of scale, and it refers to Marshall's theory.
Yes. There was not a reflection about this point in economic-based theory. It was precisely a critique. I think today there are new economic geography, new geographical economy, which explains local development by this point, by Marshall point of view. But economic base, it's not the case.
Okay, thanks. Also missed the chance to thank you a lot. I think this theory, at least I understand it, it helps us to predict the effects of new economic activities in the cities or regions. But maybe got lost a bit, whether it's about cities or regions or both, and maybe there is some scale or kind of area where a model works best. For example, thinking about Paris city, yes, the very central area of the city, or thinking about the whole metropolitan regions or some peripheral regions. So is it completely universal, or is it that somewhere this model focus more? And also in looking to the research literature, what is used more often?
Okay. I will take 3 seconds to write my answer. Yes. So concerning the terms of geographical scale, I think it is a problem of me, because I don't have in mind the precise notion of geographic. I'm an economist, but
No problem.
in literature we will see we see a lot of community term in economic-based literature. Community, it's a term, but in France, in French literature, we can read city or region or territory, but I don't know how in what extent there is difference in the meaning between English and French words. You know.
The last session will be devoted to that, right? About the also language things.
Maybe if I can jump on this one, but I think from your own work, Jessie, you had a proposition saying that the standard model worked better at lower scales and the extended model at larger scales. So both would be true at the same time. Maybe could you talk a little bit more about this?
Okay.
Did I speak? No. Did you hear my question, or was I muted?
Yes, it's okay.
Oh,
sorry.
okay, sorry.
It's okay. I think when it is necessary to lead a local impact study, a standard model is useful. But if you have a macroeconomic perspective, a global perspective, not only focused on the impact of one infrastructure, for example, it is necessary to use extended model, because they capture all of income that enter and link the region, territory, or city.
And so would that be at the national scale, or could you imagine also that maybe the European scale is more relevant? Like, what would you think is the optimal scale on this, or is there an optimal scale?
It's a good question. It's a good question because I think in European scale, it is the conventional, the standard macroeconomic approach. So Keynes approach or new Keynesianism, and not geographical approach. In macroeconomic perspective, I think it is a bad vision, but economic base show the difference between geographical macroeconomic and macroeconomic without geographical perspective. And in my mind, in European scale, it is important to question monetary system, and now more precisely geographical perspective. But in but I think maybe it can be possible to use extended model in European scale, but it's I think it's not to the optimal scale.
Thanks. And we have another question, actually from the same listener, very active person. Thanks. Are there studies based on economic-based theory that compare the economic development of several cities? So comparing cities using this theory.
Using this theory to compare cities,
Yes.
to compare development, yes, it is possible. For example, yes, I think in France, well, I think we haven't enough developed economic base. Today, we have to show the difference between cities. I focused on DevZ approach. This approach make difference between city and peripheral areas, but there are a lot of difference between cities. And so today, I think we are to develop this approach to show the details the difference between cities. It is possible. For example, in France, I think there are cities one exports a lot. It exports a lot of services, but there are two cities that not export and that depend on social base, for example, or residential base.
Thanks. And maybe getting back to the previous discussion, I was wondering, you talked about extended model and standard model. Is it that standard model is about residential economy and extended model is this residential economy plus non-residential economy, or it's wrong thinking?
I think it's wrong. I think because I'm not sure to understand, but standard model focus on export, and so it doesn't make the difference between residential and productive. But extended model make a difference between residential and productive, and so in the standard model, we can show that there are a lot of ways to develop a region or a city, not only based on exports.
Thank you.
Thanks. I think we don't have any pressing question. I will, I think, leave a minute or two for any ultimate question or someone who finds a last one to ask. And in the meantime, to leave you to think about this final question, I think I will, well, first start by thanking again Jessie for presenting the model, and also reminding our audience that if you want to continue on these seminars, our next one is going to be on the 10th of January, where we host Dr. Annegret Haze and Dr. Manuel Wolf talking about growth, urban growth and urban shrinkage, and in particular Vandenberg's model and urbanization cycles. I don't see any further question. So I think if that is it, I really want to thank you again, Jessie, congratulate you on your newly acquired PhD, and thank everyone for joining us today.